500 years ago, the Inca Empire selected its most perfect children and marched them to the tops of the highest mountains in the world. Then it killed them. The ritual was called Capacocha, the most sacred offering the empire could make, and for decades, scholars assumed the children came from one place. The capital, Cusco. Cusco was the center of everything. The navel of the world, the Inca called it. At its peak around 1500 CE, the Inca Empire controlled more than 10 million people across modern-day Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Chile, Argentina, and Colombia. They called it Tawantinsuyu, the four parts together. They built walls so precise a knife blade can't fit between the stones. They terraced entire mountainsides to grow food at 4,000 meters. And they sacrificed their empire's children to the mountains that made it all possible. It was the largest empire in pre-Columbian history, held together by roads, bureaucracy, and ritual. The empire radiated outward from this city for 4,000 kilometers along the spine of the Andes. Spanish chroniclers described Capacocha as a state ritual. Children chosen for physical perfection were paraded across the empire, feasted for months, given chicha corn beer, and then sacrificed on mountaintops above 5,000 meters. The assumption was straightforward. The children were selected in Cusco, marched outward, and sacrificed at sacred peaks across the empire. All from one city, all from elite families. But ancient DNA analysis from Capacocha burials on 3 different mountains told a completely different story. The children didn't all come from Cusco. They came from across the entire empire. 3 children, 3 mountains, 3 completely different genetic backgrounds. The empire wasn't sacrificing its own. It was collecting children from conquered peoples across 4,000 kilometers. The genetic diversity was unmistakable. These weren't children drawn from Cusco's elite lineages. They represented the full genetic breadth of the Andes: highland ancestry, coastal ancestry, southern desert ancestry. The empire drew from its entire genetic map when selecting children for sacrifice. The miniature gold and silver figurines buried with Capacocha children have been found from Ecuador to Argentina, each dressed in tiny replicas of regional clothing, representing the province each child came from. The mitochondrial haplogroups were different. The autosomal ancestry was different. These children weren't siblings. They weren't even from the same region. The most famous Capacocha discovery was made in 1999 on the summit of Volcan Lulelico in northwestern Argentina at 6,739 meters above sea level. The archaeological team led by Johann Reinhard found 3 children frozen in near-perfect preservation at the summit. The cold and dry conditions had mummified them naturally over 500 years. Reinhard's expedition required weeks of climbing and acclimatization. The burial platform sat near the summit at an altitude where most people can barely think, let alone dig. The preservation was among the finest ever documented for ancient human remains. Internal organs intact, hair with visible follicles, skin with visible pores, 500 years of natural cryogenic storage. The first piece of evidence came from the genetic profiles of the 3 Lulelico children themselves. The eldest child, a girl approximately 13 years old, carried a mitochondrial haplogroup, most common in highland populations from the Lake Titicaca region. Not Cusco, a younger girl, approximately 4 to 5 years old, carried a lineage associated with coastal populations from what is now northern Chile or southern Peru. A boy of approximately 7 carried yet another lineage, this one associated with populations from the Atacama Desert region far to the south of the Inca heartland. 3 children from 3 different corners of the empire. Not elite children from the capital. Tribute children from conquered provinces. The second piece of evidence came from isotope analysis of the children's hair, which preserved a month-by-month chemical diary of their final year. Hair grows at approximately 1 centimeter per m-onth. Each centimeter preserves the chemical signature of that month's diet and geographic location. The technique is called sequential isotope analysis. A single strand of hair becomes a biological tape recorder, documenting diet, location, and even stress levels, month by month. Each segment is dissolved and fed through a mass spectrometer that measures the precise ratios of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, and strontium isotopes. The eldest girl's hair revealed a dramatic dietary shift approximately 12 months before her death. Her diet changed from the staple foods of a commoner to the elite diet of an Inca chosen one. More maize, more animal protein, more chicha. The Spanish chronicles described a fattening period. Selected children were given the finest food the empire could provide for up to a year before sacrifice. The isotopes confirm this almost exactly. Chicha, the sacred corn beer of the Inca, was central to every state ceremony. The volume of chicha consumed during Capacocha feasting was documented by multiple Spanish witnesses as extraordinary. Coca leaf chewing was an elite privilege in the Inca Empire. Giving unlimited coca to a commoner child was itself a marker of their transformation from ordinary person to sacred offering. Strontium isotopes, which reflect the local geology where food was grown, showed she traveled from a distant province to the Cusco heartland and then to the mountain. The hair recorded the journey. The third piece of evidence came from expanding the DNA analysis to Capacocha burials on other mountains. Capacocha burials have been found on at least 40 peaks across the Andes, from Voltan Pichincha in Ecuador to Cerro El Plomo in central Chile. The practice spanned the entire empire. At every site where DNA has been recovered, the children show diverse genetic backgrounds. Not a single site has produced children who all came from the same region. The child found on Cerro El Plomo near Santiago, Chile, in 1954 was one of the first Capacocha mummies ever recovered. Recent DNA analysis places his maternal ancestry with populations from the northern Andes, over 2,000 kilometers from where he was buried. He was walked or carried more than 2,000 kilometers south from his homeland, then taken to a summit over 5,000 meters high to die. He was approximately 8 years old. The fourth piece of evidence came from coca leaf and chicha residue analysis that revealed the chemical preparation these children underwent. Coca leaf metabolites in the eldest girl's hair showed a massive increase in consumption during her final 6 months. She was being given increasingly large amounts of coca to chew. Alcohol metabolites showed the same pattern, increasing chicha consumption, culminating in extreme intoxication in the final weeks. The children were sedated for their own deaths. The eldest Lulalico girl was found in a seated position with coca leaves still in her mouth. She appears to have been heavily sedated when she froze to death at the summit. CT scanning revealed her stomach still contained food. She had eaten a maize-based meal within hours of death. The preservation was so complete that individual food particles were identifiable. The CT scans revealed no signs of physical trauma, no broken bones, no blunt force injuries. Death came from exposure and intoxication, not violence. The sedation appears to have been intentional. A child too drugged and hypothermic to resist or even fully understand what was happening. The empire designed the death to look like sleep. But here is the twist. The DNA evidence that proves these children came from across the empire also raises the most difficult question. Why? If the point was simply to honor the gods, local children would have served. The empire could have sacrificed children from Cusco on every mountain. The logistics would have been far simpler, but the Inca demanded children from conquered provinces specifically. The DNA makes this unmistakable, and that transforms Capacocha from a religious ritual into a political tool. Taking a community's most perfect child and marching that child across the empire to die on a mountain was a demonstration of absolute power. The provinces gave their children because they had no choice. It bound the conquered to the conqueror through the most intimate possible obligation. Your child's body is on our mountain. Your bloodline serves our gods. Your loyalty is now permanent. The Inca Empire was built on reciprocity, labor for protection, tribute for inclusion, but Capacocha reveals the system's darkest mechanism. The ultimate tribute wasn't gold or grain. It was children. Some researchers argue Capacocha was deployed more heavily in recently conquered or rebellious provinces. The DNA evidence, though limited, is consistent with this pattern. A haplogroup doesn't tell us whether a parent surrendered their child willingly or under threat. The DNA proves geographic diversity. It can't prove the emotional reality. The deeper investigation reveals how the logistics of Capacocha functioned across the largest empire in pre-Columbian history. The Inca road network, the Capacsuan, stretched more than 40,000 kilometers. It was the infrastructure that made Capacocha possible across such vast distances. Capacocha processions were documented by Spanish witnesses. The chosen child was dressed in the finest textiles the empire produced, accompanied by priests and attendants, and walked for weeks or months to the designated mountain. Gold and silver figurines dressed in miniature textiles were buried alongside the children. These figurines have been found at nearly every Capacocha site. The mountain itself was critical. Not any peak would do. Capacocha sites cluster on the highest volcanoes, peaks the Inca considered living deities called apus. Lulilico at 6,739 meters remains the highest known archaeological site on Earth. The Inca carried children and offerings to an altitude that kills most modern climbers. At that altitude, oxygen levels are roughly 40% of sea level. Combined with extreme cold and the sedative effects of coca and chicha, death would have come through hypothermia while semi-conscious or unconscious. Modern expeditions to Capacocha sites require supplemental oxygen and days of acclimatization. The Inca did it with children on foot, carrying elaborate offerings and ritual equipment 500 years before Gore-Tex. Modern satellite thermal imaging and drone surveys are now identifying potential Capacocha sites on peaks that have never been climbed by archaeologists. But accessing these sites requires mountaineering expeditions that cost tens of thousands of dollars each. The DNA evidence remains limited by the physical difficulty of reaching the burials. The isotopic dietary data reveals class transformation. These children went from eating the diet of commoners, predominantly potato and quinoa, to the diet of the elite, maize, camelid meat, and chicha. The textiles wrapping the children were cumbi cloth, the finest weaving in the Inca world, reserved exclusively for royalty and sacred offerings. Commoner children dressed like kings for the last year of their lives. Some researchers describe Capacocha as the ultimate social promotion, a family's child elevated from commoner to divine offering. The DNA says these families didn't volunteer from the capital's elite. They were selected from the periphery. Textile analysis supports the DNA. Some burial wrappings combine provincial weaving styles with Cusco-style cumbi. The children brought their origins with them to the mountain. On Cerro Aconcagua, the highest peak in the Americas at 6,962 meters, a 7-year-old boy was found in 1985 at 5,300 meters elevation. His burial goods matched the standardized Capacocha template found at every site. The ritual was centrally designed. The children were locally sourced. The logistics required to march a child and a full offering set to nearly 7,000 meters of elevation represent an organizational achievement that rivals any ancient engineering project. The 3 Lulilico children were genetically unrelated, not siblings, not cousins, not from the same community, 3 separate families, 3 separate provinces, 3 separate losses. The genetic diversity of the Andes is among the highest in the Americas. Populations separated by mountain ranges, deserts, and altitude zones evolved distinct genetic profiles over thousands of years. Each province had its own textile patterns, ceramic styles, and genetic signature. The Capacocha system drew from all of them. A genetic census of the empire's diversity, written in the DNA of sacrificed children. The ice maiden known as Juanita, found on Mount Ampeto in Peru in 1995. awaits full genomic analysis. But preliminary isotope work suggests she too traveled from a distant province. So, what does this change about the Inca? It changes the scale of what Capacocha represented. This wasn't a local practice. It was an empire-wide system of human tribute that reached into every conquered province and extracted the most personal offering possible. The DNA evidence, though still limited to a handful of individuals, suggests that recently conquered provinces may have been disproportionately targeted. If Capacocha occurred at every major mountain shrine during significant events like the death of a Sapa Inca or the conquest of a new province, the total number of sacrificed children over the empire's 100-year peak could number in the hundreds or more. Most of these children have never been found. The mountains are too high, too remote, and too numerous for systematic archaeological survey. Each peak is a sealed archive. Climate change is now threatening these frozen archives. As Andean glaciers retreat, Capacocha burials that survived 5 centuries of natural preservation are being exposed to temperatures that destroy DNA within years. The race between archaeology and climate change in the Andes mirrors the same crisis in the Arctic. The ice that preserved these children is melting faster than science can reach them. Integration through sacrifice. The communities these children were taken from still exist. Modern Quechua and Aymara populations along the Andes carry the same ancestral signatures found in the Capacocha genomes. For these communities, the Capacocha children aren't abstract scientific specimens. They're ancestors. The debate over whether these remains should be repatriated is ongoing and unresolved. A comprehensive genomic study of all recoverable Capacocha remains could map the empire's tributary network with genetic precision. Which provinces gave children? Which mountains received them? The DNA could reconstruct the political geography of sacrifice. But many Capacocha mummies are held by museums that restrict destructive sampling. The tension between scientific discovery and cultural respect for the remains limits what researchers can access. Every sacred peak along the Andes potentially holds another child, another genome, another story of a family that gave what empires demand. The Inca built roads that still exist, terraces that still grow food, and they left children on mountains where the ice preserved them perfectly for 500 years. Identity is a story empires tell. DNA is what the ice remembers, and the ice says these children came from everywhere the empire reached. If this investigation changed how you think about empires, sacrifice, and what power costs the powerless, consider subscribing, because the next case file involves a Mediterranean empire where DNA just proved the people being sacrificed weren't who the historians blame. Somewhere above the clouds, on a peak no one has climbed since the empire fell, another child is waiting, frozen, preserved, still carrying the answer to where they came from.